What's the difference between being a conservative and being America First?
Well, the reason is I think the term conservative, and I would say everything I'm saying, there's a parallel version of it for liberal and the left, but that's less my concern or what you probably want to hear from me. But what I think the term conservative itself is ill-defined today. And so I think that if there's one thing that unites the conservative movement today, it is its opposition to radical left-wing excess. But if you ask the question of what does it actually stand for, that question I think is far more unanswered. Even the values or the value systems that conservatives are seeking to conserve have in some ways actually been eroded and disappeared in the country, which requires a kind of creation, which has historically been a progressive project rather than a conservative project. That gets a little etymological and philosophical, but in a more practical sense, even the modern conservative movement consists of, I think, a rather widely disparate group of movements within it. You would have the neoliberal informed, or what you might call neoconservative vision of conservatism, Bush-era Republican conservatism, versus a more nationalist America First direction that speaks to certainly my vision for the future of the country. But if you double click on that, that itself is comprised of at least two, if not more, different factions within it as well. And so anyway, for me, I think a lot of these labels can be confining, and that's one of the reasons I've tried to maybe go out of my way more so than an average politician to write a larger number of books, articles, take a little bit more, go to the distance a little bit to lay out what my views actually are, rather than to have them be analogized to somebody's pre-existing category of where they try to fit me in.
I'm unafraid of being a little etymological. We're here on a podcast. I've been thinking about George W. Bush recently. I have to think about him. He's a big figure in my own cosmology. And he was understood in his day as a nationalist, right? This was an era of flag pins. You're wearing a flag pin right now, like the post 9/11 period. What I see in the America First world is a sense that what came before was insufficiently nationalist. If I was to say what unites all of you together, it is a sense of renewed nationalism, and a sense that nationalism was betrayed, not just by a left that you say has excesses, but a right that lost the plot. In what way was George W. Bush not nationalist?
Well, the short version of the answer to that question would be interventionist foreign policy and the use of American taxpayer and even life resources to advance goals that didn't directly advance or even indirectly advance the American interest. That's the short version of the answer to that question. But actually, if you want to go longer form in terms of history here, let's go even further back to the evolution of modern conservatism and how we got to where we are. I think if you go back to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, this is a kind of modern original sin in American politics of the creation of a nanny state. To me, I include the entitlement state, which is the state that gives away stuff, welfare, Medicaid, et cetera. There's the regulatory state, the rise of three-letter agencies to administer this larger form of government, the regulatory state. And then there's the foreign nanny state, which is the foreign aid complex and the foreign interventionist complex. What I think of as classical conservatism in the latter half of the 20th century was a reactionary response to that LBJ vision of the Great Society that got watered down through what we would say the rise of neoconservatism, Bush-era conservatism, that effectively accepted that this sort of larger form of government in some form was here to stay, that we're not really going to undo the Great Society, that we're not really going to undo the existence of the regulatory state, but we want to be thoughtful about curbing its overgrowth, while at the same time saying that while we're at it, and we got big government, we might as well use it to spread democracy using capitalism as a vector to do it. And if we're not going to use capitalism to do it, we'll use military force to do it. And that's a different kind of big government that became accepted in the form of conservative doctrine, not just accepted, but a central feature of it. And then what I see in the America First response right now is a unified response that is against that neoconservative vision. And I think what you see in broadly what's thought of in popular circles as the America First movement today, but what I call the protectionist wing of the America First movement, is an economic objective, an economic project. You could call it economic populism or economic nationalism. But in some ways, the protectionist strand of this says, okay, well, if big government's going to be here to stay, we don't just want to curb it, we actually want to use it to advance substantive goals of our own. Versus the strand that I'm more identified with, what I've certainly termed the national libertarian or national liberty strand of America First, says that actually the whole project, we got to actually keep our eye on the ball, was dismantling the existence of that nanny state in all of its forms, the entitlement state, the regulatory state, and the foreign nanny state. And, we've gotten into the thick of a lot
No,
here
this
very
is great.
quickly.
I'm glad to get into it. Were Medicare and Medicaid mistakes?
I believe they were, with the benefit of retrospect, particularly Medicaid, particularly the welfare state, without work attachments required attached to it. Medicare and Social Security I put in a different category, which we can get to later, and I think is a little bit orthogonal to the discussion, certainly that I'm most interested in having, that I think is on the money right now. But when
Why?
you think about
Why are they in a
Medicaid and
different
welfare-
category?
Well, I think that Social Security, you kind of had my real issue there is if we'd ever actually taken advantage of the surplus that we had. It's a bit more mechanical issue that if you just allowed for the surplus to be invested at rates of normalized returns of the stock market or a diversified portfolio, we'd have a far excess surplus that would be sustaining itself. So it was you pay in, you pay out versus having a redistributionist quality to it versus what I think of as the welfare state. My principal issue with it is that it actually, I think the evidence would show, in my opinion, that it has harmed the very people that it was created to actually help. But, my core focus actually, even in my presidential campaign, had been less taking aim at that, though I do think that that's a project we have to come back to, but was to take aim at least the regulatory state that was a close cousin of that state. And I think basically what happened in the 60s is we traded off our sovereignty for this stuff. And I think the problem we're basically going to run into as a country is eventually that stuff is going to run out in the form of our national debt crisis, and we're left with neither sovereignty nor stuff. And I think this should be the central focus and concern of the conservative movement, which is not quite today. That brings me back to this distinction between the national protectionist and the national libertarian camps of the America First movement. And the irony is I've made the case for the more national libertarian strain, let's just say in recent months, in a more pronounced way in particular. One of the criticisms I've gotten is that just a reversion to a kind of neoconservatism or neoliberalism. And my sort of retort back to that, and this is at the bleeding edge of America First debates right now, is that actually the America First wing, the protectionist wing's acceptance of the big state is actually the permanent codification of the neoconservative premise that rejected the classical conservatism that was hostile to the existence of the nanny state in the first place.